Hey, good morning, everybody. It's Tuesday and time for Take 5, so let's jump right in. We've been recapping the sermon from Sunday that I preached entitled Comfortable Chains. This is the sixth installment of our Back to Basics series, and this month we've been talking about the Exodus, the 10 plagues that God sent on Egypt and Israel's journey through the wilderness to the Red Sea. One thing that I have recognized about us Americans is that our lives are centered around our comfort. I mean, we spare no expense and we will go to great lengths to make sure that we are comfortable in every area of our life. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, some great things have come along, some great inventions and some great ideas have been born because of our desire for comfort. Things like running water and electricity, and maybe the most important in this season right now, air conditioning, right? Those are some great inventions and some great things that were birthed out of our desire for more comfort. And those are not necessarily bad things, but we have a tendency, if we're not careful, to become too comfortable in life. We become too comfortable in things that matter, and especially in our relationships with God, in spiritual matters. And I think we see a picture of Israel there in Egypt becoming a little too comfortable in their slavery. That's why I entitled this message Comfortable Chains, because really I believe that Israel had become comfortable in their chains, in their bondage, in their slavery. I think that they were comfortable there. They didn't like it. They didn't enjoy it. But I think they were comfortable in their chains because the alternative would have been, right, to revolt, to rebel, to try to fight for their freedom. And I think in a sense, Israel was just content and comfortable, more comfortable at least, to stay in their chains than to fight for their freedom. The reason I believe that, number one, is because the Bible tells us in Exodus chapter 12 that there were about 600,000 men, not including women and children, in Israel. So if you look at the numbers and you study it, and we've done it for years, tried to figure out exactly how many people were in the Hebrew nation at this time, our best guess is that there were about 2.4 million people, Israelite people, in the land of Egypt in total. So my question is, at this point, there's 2.4 million people in Egypt, and Pharaoh said in Exodus chapter 1 that the Hebrew people outnumbered the Egyptian people in their own land. So why was there nobody throughout the Hebrew people that ever looked at those numbers, looked at the fact that they outnumbered the Egyptians and decided to fight their way to freedom? I mean, it seems that Pharaoh was more concerned about it than they were. Why did nobody ever look at that and go, hey, we can fight, we can rebel, we can revolt, we can fight ourselves to freedom? The truth is, I think it was just a little too comfortable for them. They had the basic necessities of life, and they knew that in order to lead a revolt or to fight back, to fight for their freedom from their bondage, it was going to require some effort. It was going to cost them a lot, maybe even some lives. The second reason I think they had become comfortable in their chains is because if you look at the events that take place after they have been freed from Egypt, every time they faced a difficult circumstance in their life in the wilderness, they kept wanting to go back to Egypt, back to slavery, back to their bondage, back to their chains. One time when they were at the Red Sea, you remember when they were at the Red Sea and Pharaoh and his soldiers were coming behind them to capture them again and to take them back to Egypt. They look at Moses and they say, we told you that you should have left us alone in Egypt. It would have been better for us to be a slave in Egypt than to be a corpse in the wilderness. Really? Your chains, the affliction and the bondage that you were in Egypt is better than the freedom of the wilderness? Then one time, right after they get across the Red Sea and God does that miraculous event right there, they find themselves several days later struggling to find food. And rightfully so. For 2.4 million people to have enough food in the wilderness is, that's going to be a struggle. And this time they get angry and they say, if only the Lord would have killed us back in Egypt. At least there We sat around pots filled with meat and ate all the bread we wanted. But now in the wilderness, we starve to death. They were saying in this moment, really, it would be better for us to be back in our slavery, back in our chains, back in our affliction, because at least there we had food to eat. At least there we had enough food to go around for everybody. Then God miraculously answered that need and that problem, and He rained down manna from heaven. You remember that story? And after days or weeks of eating this manna every day, that God literally rained down from heaven, feeding 2.4 million people. They get tired of the food. They get tired of eating the same thing every day. And they say, we remember the fish we used to eat for free in Egypt. Was it really free? What was the food that they were given by the Egyptians? Was it really free? Then they said, and we had all of the cucumbers and melons and leeks, all the onions and all the garlic we wanted. But now our appetites are gone because all we ever see is this manna. How could you really be so comfortable in your bondage that you would be willing to trade your freedom for that little bit of pleasure, that little bit of food? And then one last time, maybe the most infamous story in Israel's history, they get all the way 40 or 2.5 years later, they get all the way to the edge of their promised land, the thing that God had been promising to give them for generations and generations. They get there, they send those 12 spies in, and they come back with a bad report, and all of the people begin to bicker and complain and murmur, and they say once again to Moses, why didn't you just leave us in Egypt? It would have been better for us to stay there. But now we're out here in the wilderness, and we're going to have to fight to take this country. Some of us are going to die in battle. Our wives and our little ones are going to be carried off as plunder. It would have been better for us to stay in Egypt. And the Bible says they began to plot amongst themselves to choose a new leader and go back to Egypt. Go back to their slavery. Go back to their bondage. Go back to their chains. Somewhere along the way, Israel had become too comfortable in their chains. They had become too comfortable in the things that bound them in this life. And they were willing to trade the hardships of freedom for the bondage of slavery. Somehow, Israel had become comfortable in their chains. I wonder, are there any of us that might be comfortable in our chains today? We'll talk about it some more tomorrow. Hey, I hope you have a great day today. I'll see you again right here tomorrow on Take 5.